We had a really cool project with a company called Statera. They actually made athletes run a marathon. At intervals, they took blood samples from a finger prick, and we would test the dynamics of a panel of metabolites in their blood so that they could specially design supplements to give the runners what they're actually depleted in. If you're running a marathon, you need things, but you don't want to have too much of something you don't need. Otherwise, now that's a metabolic burden and you're actually tiring your body out. You can make a smart supplement.
I think it's definitely time now that we talk about what a mass spectrometer is. How does it work?
A mass spectrometer is basically a very sensitive balance that identifies things based on their mass. If you had 100 people in a room and you could make a chart that had their name associated with how much they weighed when you put them on a scale, then if you pass that list and that group of people on to somebody else, they wouldn't have to ask them for ID. You could just put them on a scale and say, hey, you must be Steve because you weigh this mass. And so it helps you identify what each molecule is, because every molecule, if you go to enough decimal places, will have a unique mass.
Do you see these instruments getting small to the point where like you can fit one in a fridge to test pesticide-ridden fruit?
If you put a mass spectrometer into the fridge and it tested all the time only for the mass of the pesticide or some kind of indicator of fruit spoilage.
In airports, they take that swab and they'll kind of like swab your backpack. Is that a mass spec? Dr. Jeff Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a couple of months in the making, as many of those episodes are, honestly. Thanks for coming on. And do you wanna talk about what happened as while we record? Do you care about it, or?
I'm sure I can talk about anything today. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we were gonna record this sometime last semester, but you had a bit of a disaster, to say the least, in your house. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Made for an interesting fall term. Yeah. August last year we had flash flood. Actually, the city just released the stats. Places in Ottawa had 160 millimeters of rainfall in an hour.
Jeez.
Which is way beyond the, like, an engineering, civil engineering, they make these models like the 100-year storm, etc. It's way beyond the 100-year storm. Anyways, it flooded a park. The park basically turned into a river that flowed between houses and backyards and things like that and came right to my property and flooded my house. So we came home from vacation to 4 feet of water mixed with sewage throughout our entire lower level. So anyways, yeah, it's been quite the cleanup and quite the remediation. And you mix in an older house with a different older infrastructure and asbestos in the drywall and all this kind of stuff. It's just like confounding factors that make cleanup that much harder. So, but we're almost done. We're almost back, and we've settled with insurance, and we're
thank God. I was going to say
rebuild is well on its way.
I was going to say I hope that insurance is covering at least some of this.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny. I don't know how many people listen to a podcast for this type of advice, but honestly, advise when you do have insurance, you check the policy to make sure that you have water coverage, and it's 2 types. There's a sewer type and there's an overland water type. Lots of times they'll sell you quote unquote water coverage, but it's not both. You have to make sure it is both. And the other thing that's always also buried in the fine print is that the amount of coverage is often a fairly low dollar amount, but it doesn't cost much more to actually make it the full content of like the value of your entire house. Mm-hmm. So I had many neighbors who found that out the hard way.
Okay, well,
but we are fortunately not in that position. So
I wish you guys a better outcome next time, and hopefully this doesn't happen. I hope you guys have put some form of checks and balances for this to not
for sure. You can bet the wheels are spinning in my mind how to safeguard against doing this again or this happening again in the future. We have met with city engineers who've come by and donated their time. Actually, they've been awesome to help think, next time this happened, the water flowed from here to here. So if you build the ground up there, it would make it flow over there instead, and etc.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into your research a little bit.
Sure.
You're a professor at Carleton.
Mm-hmm.
You have been very active in different conferences. You've been to several different ones. I mean, even during last summer, I remember when we were talking. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to get into those a little bit. Mm-hmm. You are, I believe, Ottawa's foremost mass spec expert. Well, is that fair to say?
I bet you my colleagues at the University of Ottawa would disagree. I don't actually think that's true. I feel like in Ottawa, people probably know my name, but I wouldn't say I'm the premier expert, especially because my postdoc supervisor is also in Ottawa, and he's far surpasses my CV in terms of productivity. No, it's funny. We actually have a very collegial community with mass spectrometrists in the city and in the country, and actually beyond as well. don't think we go so far as to rank ourselves. But, I appreciate that comment.
Okay, so then how did you get into this field? Because it's quite the unique niche of specialty to get into, for one. And two, I'd like to know your research background. What got you interested in science, and how did you find yourself as an experienced person in mass spectrometry?
I did my undergrad at Trent University, Peterborough. I'm a Peterborough boy. I grew up there. As a kid, I'd play on the campus, and then I found myself doing my undergrad there. And while I was there, a couple of stars aligned in the universe. Mass spectrometers have been around a really long time, but it was in the 90s, late 90s, that their prominence in biomolecule research really started to rise. So I was in my third year of my undergrad when I was approached by a new faculty member who was a biochemist, Stephen Rafferty, and he asked me to do my fourth year project in his group. And I accepted, and we didn't really know what we were going to work on. As we talked about it, we realized that Trent University had just landed a big CFI grant for a water quality center, is what they still use it for. But it was really as a bunch of mass spectrometers that were being used for that purpose, water quality, testing for residual contaminants and things in water samples. But he was interested in starting to broach out into this new topic of using mass spectrometry to study biomolecules. So he asked if I'd be interested, and I knew nothing about mass spectrometry at the time. I took a course with a professor named Ray March. It was the last course that he taught before he retired. And I didn't, of course, lots of times as an undergrad, you don't really realize the impact the professors that are teaching you have on the world. Turns out he was very impactful in the Canadian mass spectrometry scene. He's one of the father of Iontrap theory. He's released a lot of different books on this and was very well known across the field, as a very social man. And so Stephen Rafferty and Ray March sort of took me under their wing when I did my fourth year. And we tried to do protein analysis on a mass spectrometer. And I knew nothing. Like there was very little literature on it. We're just like, let's just throw this in the mass spec and see what happens. We made every mistake in the book along the way, but we got some interesting results. And it was so new from a global perspective at the time. Almost anything you do, people found interesting. So yeah, I finished my undergrad, and Stephen Rafferty was very interested in continuing the research. Trent didn't have a graduate program at the time, so he made an arrangement with York University and Michael Sue and the Center for Research in Mass Spectrometry to become an adjunct at York and therefore continue and have his hand in the project as it continued at York, as I continued my graduate studies there. 9 months into my master's, I find myself speaking to an audience of 2,000 people at the American Society for Mass Spectrometry on protein analysis because it's such an exciting new field. And I'm super green. I was butterflies, to say the least. What was
the largest audience that you've had the chance of presenting to?
That was probably it.
That was the one, huh?
Yeah, probably around 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to think about that more, but it's probably that one, 2,000. I was the sixth speaker in the session. Everybody else, especially now that I look back on it, they were the heavy hitters in the field. And I think sort of just for equity purposes, they allowed one student to be a speaker, and I was that student. So I didn't even realize who else was in the session. I look back now and I realize, man, some very influential people. But because of the rising popularity of it, they had underestimated the size of the room. They had a room with probably like 1,700 seats, but 2,000 people. So the walls were lined with people. People were sitting in the aisles. And I'm sitting there for the first 5 speakers until I went just listening to like 1,999 people rustling papers and coughing. You know the sounds people make when they're just in an audience listening. Oh man, the nerves just were wild. I went up there, I gave my talk, and I delivered it fine. And then I got home. I tried a few experiments more, realized everything I concluded was utterly wrong.
Man, I know that
but that's fine. I mean, we ended up publishing that work. It was just our perspective on what the data meant.
Yeah.
Nobody called me on it, obviously, at the conference when I was presenting. But
I don't know if you might get a couple emails after this then.
Yeah. Nobody remembers. That was in 2000. No, 2001. Sorry, 2001. Okay. Talking a long time ago. Anyways, so then I finished my PhD. And I went on to do a postdoc at University of Ottawa for 3 years. I continued doing protein analysis, post-translational modification analysis for 2 years. And then the final year of my postdoc, I transitioned into doing lipid analysis using mass spectrometry. And then I started my career here in 2008. And I I've done protein analysis and lipid analysis, as well as a whole host of other things.
So then you kind of got introduced to mass spectrometry later on in your undergraduate degree, but you weren't aware. Were you aware that you wanted to become a professor at the time?
Oh, no,
That just happened?
no, yeah, no. There's lots of serendipitous things that happen through life, and the advice I give to students these days when they're really not sure what they want to do is just make decisions that keep doors open.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing. Is if you make a decision where you really pigeonhole yourself,
Right.
if that's really what you want to do, well, then that's the right decision. That's fine. But for the most part, the decisions that I chose to make were just, I'm going to continue to study. Should I finish at a master's? I don't know what I want to do, so I'm going to do a PhD, and I'm going to continue with the notion that having a PhD and a doctorate in the field, especially in industry, allows more opportunities for leadership, rising through the ranks and things like that, which was interest to me. My PhD, as I mentioned, was in the group with Michael Sue at York University. At the time, he had a rather rare grant, an industrial-sponsored NSERC grant. And the industrial sponsor was a company called SciEx, which makes mass spectrometers. And they happen to be 5 minutes up the highway from York University.
Okay.
So it's funny, if you read my thesis, like all of the data that actually appears in my thesis, I acquired at SciEx. So I was actually working in the company using their tweaked hot rod instruments to get like better data, helping them advance some of their ideas at the same time as satisfying the demands of my PhD. Anyways, the reason I bring that up is I was pretty certain that I was going to work in industry. I mean, I had my foot in that door pretty firmly.
Yeah.
And it could have gone that way. But I came back to that same crossroads where I'm like, okay, do I do this? If I move into industry, academia probably won't be an option anymore. I said, maybe I do want academia. I'm not sure. So I chose to do a postdoc, knowing that after a postdoc, I could go back to industry. That's still an option, but it might open up something for academia as well, which obviously it did.
You can do the other way around. If you went into industry, why did you say that that may close up the door for academia?
Because the currency for academia, especially for getting a faculty job, is publishing articles.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're working for industry, you're subject to the interests of the company.
Okay.
So you're working in R&D, there's still a chance. Like there's definitely some excellent scientists at SciEx still who publish articles. And it's in their best interest because they're publishing in peer-reviewed scientific journals on developments that they make. But you might not land that role. You might be in a product application lab where you just receive samples from other people who are potential buyers, and you have to make methods. Those methods never get optimized fully or published. They just demonstrate to the potential customer, that their mass specs are, will serve the purpose and have great performance. And then that goes to the sales team, and the sales team uses it to close deals and things. So one of the reasons it can close the door to academia is because if you go for a bit of a gap in your publication record, it's just hard to keep up because the people you're competing against for faculty positions don't have gaps in their publication record.
Okay, that makes sense. And then how did you land the position at Carleton to become a professor?
So I was lucky. This takes me now to the postdoc. I worked with Daniel Figues. Daniel Figues, as much as I just said it's hard to get into academia from industry, that's exactly what he did. He was a VP at a company called MDS Proteomics. They're doing really interesting work trying to map out all protein-protein interactions in the human proteome. It came on the heels of the Human Genome Project, and I think let's turn our attention to proteins. A lot of interesting work came out of that. The company was acquired, and then things happened, and things shifted. And in the process, he was recruited by University of Ottawa to set up the Ottawa Institute for Systems Biology. And I was one of 4 postdocs that started with him. I was one of his first postdocs. And it was an amazing experience because he started out with a lot of support, financial support. He had some pretty good, nice grants and lots of support from University of Ottawa. Hiring 4 postdocs. For any academic that hears, I'm just going to hire 4 postdocs right out of the gates. That's not super common. It means you've been pretty well supported financially off the bat. And so postdocs obviously, help to lead research projects within the groups, but under them, there's graduate students and undergraduates. So I find myself basically immediately thrust into a position of leadership, helping to get a new research program off the ground for his group, and at the same time, having my hand in everybody's research projects. So over 3 years, I had my name on 18 publications.
That's impressive.
Which was great. And, it is impressive. I'm happy with the work and I'm happy with that accomplishment. It's not like I did all of that work, but I was there as a resource because I had my PhD in extensive history in mass spectrometry based proteomics, how to make sure mass spectrometer is optimized, how to fix things, how to run projects, um, to get the outcome that you're desiring, or to test a hypothesis rather that you're really trying to test. And so I made an academic and valid academic contribution to many grad students and undergrad students' research projects that were not directly mine, but I was in there as well. So I went into my postdoc with my name, I think, on 3 or 4 papers, and then I had like 20 something 3 years later, which made me quite competitive for faculty position, which was great.
Awesome. And I mean, I've been to your lab in Stacy.
Mhm.
It is quite the complex setup because it's like retrofitted with different types of mass spectrometers. You have different chromatography machines. And I remember you said that you had to have a very specific setup for the way that it cools, draws air in and out of the room, because those machines tend to get very hot. So how did the whole setup and discussions with Carleton get to actually give you the entire room and set it up the way that it needs to be set up to run an optimal facility?
These are great questions. I like to go on record to say that I did not give you these questions, but if I had, these were the questions I would have given you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so that's like the next sort of transition of my career. I started here 2008, and I had got tenured and building the group and doing some good research, and then I got frustrated. Good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Then I got frustrated by some of the limitations in the system. And one of the main limitations from my perspective is the fact that mass spectrometers are expensive, especially if you want the best ones. They're upwards of $1 million or more.
For one instrument.
For one instrument, yeah. Yeah. If you want one of the best omics machines out there, like especially if you're like getting the latest model, like 1.5 to 2 million is not unheard of.
Jeez.
And so trying to come up with that money is not easy. And in Canada, we have a great mechanism for it, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, CFI. But it's not like you can just get a CFI grant every year. They're hard to get. They're hard to get from a CFI perspective, but even more than that, these infrastructure grants are often adjudicated internally within Carleton. So you have to make Carleton agree it's a priority of the university, giving one. And you can imagine everybody across the campus has interesting things they want to do, and the university has to decide what is our priority. So even if I did get a CFI allocation, as they call it, 1 year, just political reasons alone, there's no way I'm going to get another one for like 5 years, because I had my chance and I'm doing great things with it, but it's somebody else's turn. That just makes sense. That's equity.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking to myself, like, in the Canadian system where, our research dollars are smaller than the US system, I'm trying to be internationally competitive with the newest infrastructure. How can I change the model so that I'm not solely dependent on this grant-based mechanism to get new infrastructure, because I'm slowly being left behind, by the competition out there, because everybody else is getting new instruments. So in 2015, 2014, I guess 2015, I was on sabbatical, and I started to make some plans in close collaboration with our dean at the time, Dr. Malcolm Butler, who was fantastically supportive at the concept of creating center for analysis with mass spectrometry that did research, did everything that the mass spec, my research, my lab did already, but included another aspect where we engage with the local community to help solve analytical problems and form partnerships that can access pots of funding that I can't alone, nor can the industrial partner access alone.
Interesting.
And so by doing that, we could basically build a business model where we generate revenue through the income that comes from these grants coming in, and sometimes just straight up income from running samples for external clients. And we have this business underpinning that's also now happening in the lab, and that generates revenue, and that kind of money I can spend however I want, obviously.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? It's not like it has to be confined by the rules of the granting agency. So we can do, for example, things that you can't do with grants, like we can talk to a third-party broker and finance instruments, amortize payments over 5 years. You don't have to come up with $1 million immediately. We can amortize it like you'd pay for a car over 5 years.
Right.
The same reason people finance cars, so you don't buy it cash, because a lot of people don't have that capital right off the bat. And so that made it more convenient for us to think of different financial models of how we could raise revenue that offsets amortization costs of infrastructure and then stay competitive by having the latest toys in the lab. So it worked. We got approval. The Stacy building, the chemistry building, was starting to undergo a series of micro renovations for research space, and they chose ours to kind of go first. And we consolidated all of the mass specs that we had in different rooms around campus into one single room.
Mhm.
Same time, we launched the Carleton Mass Spectrometry Center, the CMSC, and we had initiatives where we did like called it the Carleton Front Door at the time, where we actually hosted events at Carleton where we invited the local community to come in, tell us their problems, their analytical challenges. We sat down, we thought of ways that we could help solve them. And in the early days, honestly, I'd say like 1 out of every 3, we're like, actually, we could really help you with this. Other times it's like, oh, that's a really tricky problem. And if you look at the resourcing that you're willing to commit, it probably won't be enough and things like that. But 1 out of 3, you're like, actually, we could really make something work. So in our first year, we partnered with Broadhead Beer, and we got some government money to grant to study how their beer ages over time and help them delineate the parameters over which they can store in terms of time and temperature, and the beer still remains good. The next year, we had a similar one with Bridgehead Coffee. Same thing. They want to be able to tell in their coffee when their beans are aging to the point that they're going to lose their special characteristics that they paid a premium for those beans. And so we use mass spectrometry to sort of sniff out these tastes and these various chemical aspects of these foods that help answer these questions. But in the same time, we're feeding revenue into the center, and then we're able to support the infrastructure that also supports our research endeavors as well. So it's been, the rest is history. We've had some amazing collaborations. I've had wacky conversations I never thought I would ever have. Again, my background is in biomolecule analysis, and I've had conversations with various producers of oil. We've had conversations with companies that are into the supplement market for runners. We had a really cool project with a company called Statera, where they actually made athletes run a marathon, and every 5 kilometers or something like that, I can't remember, at intervals, they took blood samples from a finger prick, and we would test the dynamics of panel of metabolites in their blood, so that they could specially design supplements to give the runners what they're actually depleted in, rather than just give them a lot of other things.
Right.
The thought is, like, if you're running a marathon, you need things, but you don't want to have too much of something you don't need. Otherwise, now that's a metabolic burden, and you're actually tiring your body out.
Right.
You can make a smart supplement. Anyways, that's the logic for the project worked. You know, company's doing great, and to be able to help local companies like that at the same time access government grants that help us support our research initiatives through, supporting our infrastructure, like, it's just win. Like, everybody's benefiting from this, so it's really worked well.
And out of curiosity, for the mass spec analysis that is involved in measuring the way that beer degrades over time and to figure out the shelf life, what kind of biomarkers or what markers are you looking for when you analyze these samples to figure out, oh, this seems to spike at this point, when indicating it's going bad?
Right. I'll be honest with you, it's been too long and I don't actually remember the chemical names now. That study was done 2015 now. One of the other, I won't call it a downside, but working with companies, there's an agreement that things that we find become protectable by the company.
So, you don't have to get into specifics.
Honestly, what I said before is true. I honestly don't remember, but I also think that we also had to be careful, like how we couldn't publish a lot of this results too, which was, that was, I guess, a bit of a negative side, because they wanted that intel for their own product lines and standing their own processes and have competitive edge.
Yeah,
but it was interesting. We used Headspace GCMS analysis for that project. So we took some beer, we put it into a 20 milliliter scintillation vial. We heated it up to 80 degrees for a while, and all the volatiles, everything that evaporated out of the beer, would go into the gas above the headspace, and you'd analyze that. And so we'd see 15, 20, 25 different molecules, like crazy stuff. I hadn't done food analysis before.
Right.
Each of these things, as it comes out, the mass spec will identify it. And when you look at the MSDS for these compounds, you're like, it's kind of a toxic thing. Why is it in food? And then you realize food is a combination of a lot of things at a certain doses are quite bad for you, but low doses have positive effect
Right.
and give it taste. And anyways, getting insight to that was fascinating because I'd never really thought about what makes taste. But we had some insight into that with the coffee project and with this beer project. And so yeah, that's how we approached that analysis.
Can you talk about the glasses? I remember you were mentioning when we were doing the little tour around your lab back in Bill's lab, there was like some glass thing that you were talking about.
Yeah. So it's a common theme. I'll talk about specifics for that one, but the common theme with many different industries and clients that come into the Mass Spec Center is that they've got some kind of process for their product. Works great. It's been working well for years. Something goes wrong. They don't know why. It's gone funny. So the example you mentioned was a company that made 3D glasses for movie theaters.
Right. That's the one.
And they import the glass and different components and different chemicals. Obviously, they buy it from different suppliers. And then they formulate it to put the coatings on the glass so that it works. It causes the 3D effect in the theaters. And the coating stopped sticking to the glass. And they're like, what is going on? We have done nothing different. It's the same product and the same process line that we're using.
Right.
But for whatever reason, their glasses don't work anymore. And that's a bit of a panic. That's their main product.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. So they came to us and they gave us some of the glass that worked before, and then their new lot of glass that they ordered from whatever their supplier was. And we did the same thing. We smashed the glass. We put it into that headspace analysis. We heated it up and we looked at all the volatiles that came off. And we didn't actually identify like conclusively what it was that was causing the difference. Like we didn't deduce because this molecule is here, it doesn't stick anymore, but we saw differences.
Okay.
And that's really all it took for them to go back to the supplier and say, hey, this is not the same stuff. Something's changed on your end. And then they did the same kind of reverse engineering and say, oh, I'm so sorry, you're right. Something has changed. They fixed it and then problem solved.
Very nice.
We had a similar example with a company that makes jam. Those little packets of jam.
Yes, I
remember this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the foil lids. You
like
go
the
like
ones where you have in breakfast places.
Greasy spoon restaurant.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Those little things, the single use. You get the toast and you scoop it out.
Yeah.
And they started getting complaints that the jam was tasting like the customers were saying it tastes like there's diesel fuel in it.
Yeah, that's insane.
Many people know what diesel fuel tastes like, but anyways, some kind of
probably associated with the smell.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. I'm sure that's what it was. And so, yeah, we did the same thing. We looked at the jam and the stuff that didn't taste like diesel fuel and the stuff that did. Sure enough, we see all these alkanes, and it was because of a change in the formulation of the glue that held the foil wrapper to the top of the plastic cup. And so again, they went back and they said, change it back, and they did, and then problem solved. So it's cool things like that I've gotten involved in. The science is fascinating, but it's rewarding because you really, you're helping people solve a problem.
Sure.
It's holding up their product line, and I'm sure everybody that works in the company is on the edge of their seat saying, oh man, what's going to happen if we can't sell our product, et cetera, et cetera. Like you're helping a lot of people down the chain. So it's cool.
That's awesome. Okay, I think I can't avoid this. Not to say that I was avoiding it, but I think it's definitely time now that we talk about what the heck a mass spectrometer is, how does it work, and what are the differences amongst the different types of mass spectrometers out there.
So it's easier to start by talking about how they're all the same. A mass spectrometer is basically a very sensitive balance that identifies things based on their mass. So if you had 100 people in a room and you could make a chart that had their name associated with how much they weighed when you put them on a scale, then if you passed that list and that group of people on to somebody else, they wouldn't have to ask them for ID. You could just put them on a scale and say, hey, you must be Steve because you weigh this mass. And so it helps you identify what each molecule is, because every molecule, if you go to enough decimal places, will have a unique mass.
I just want to say that is a beautiful analogy. I've never heard an explanation made that way before, but it really puts into perspective exactly what a mass spectrometer is.
Thank you. So you identify what something is, but then also based on the intensity of the signal of that mass, you can do quantitation. You can tell how much of something is there. So it's an amazing tool because many times a detector in a lab just detects something, but a mass spectrometer simultaneously separates things based on their masses, and also detects it and allows quantitation. So obviously I'm biased, but I feel like it's the most important analytical tool out there in terms of laboratory analysis. And I know I'm not the only one. I've had conversations with CEOs of pharmaceutical companies and stuff, and when they hear that I'm in mass spec, they'll kind of jokingly say, eventually everything has to come up with a mass spec method and be the gold standard of how to analyze it.
Interesting.
So it's great. I'm glad I'm in this field.
Yeah.
As for what makes mass specs different, they all have the same 3 characteristics. I mentioned they measure mass, but the way that they measure the mass is by flying charged particles, charged things with mass, through the inside geometry of the instrument. So the first thing that you have to do is put charge onto the thing you're trying to analyze. Make it an ion, the word that we use. So ionization is the first step, and there's a whole slew of different ways that you can make things ionize. But once it's ionized, it's going to be affected by an electromagnetic field, and so it's the electromagnetic field inside the instrument that causes it to migrate and go through internal geometry of the mass spec. And based on its motion, you can therefore calculate what its mass and charge, its really mass to charge ratio is. And then once you know charge, you can figure out what the mass is. So every mass spectrometer ionizes molecules, measures their mass by having some kind of manipulation of the trajectory inside, and then detects it at the end. And you can get mass spectrometers out there now that are under 6 figures, like under $100,000 that do this. But you can also spend upwards of $20 million also on a mass spectrometer that still operates based on those 3 principles. It's just the technology and how you do mass manipulation inside is different. There's lots of different ways to do that, and each different way has benefits, pros and cons, but also different price tags associated with it. So some of the more crude in terms of data quality, but cheaper mass specs that are out there. As a company I saw at the last American Society for Mass Spectrometry meeting that literally sells a backpack with their mass spectrometer. It can fit in a backpack.
That's crazy.
It runs on a battery.
How big is this backpack?
Yeah, it's not unreasonable. It kind of honestly, it kind of looks like a backpack you see at a student on campus running around. It's not. It's a backpack.
Yeah.
It's not like a giant. Yeah, a backpack.
Yeah.
But of course, like something like that, you're gonna have less accuracy in your results, less sensitivity, so you can't see like lower concentration compounds. There's some drawbacks, but there's many applications you don't have to worry about that, and that's good enough. Then that's great, and you can spend that money. You can also get new mass specs out there that have there's only a couple of these in the world, but they have 22 Tesla magnets on them that are bigger than this whole room. And
what's the purpose of something like that?
The purpose of that is to have extreme mass accuracy.
Okay.
To like measuring mass differences equivalent to the mass of an electron, like to the 6th, 7th decimal place. And when you have that kind of mass accuracy, you can look at extraordinarily complicated samples. And even though there's 10,000 things in the sample with different masses, the peaks are so narrow that every individual species shows up as a unique, discrete peak on your spectrum. And so there's that advantage. But the disadvantage is $20 million.
So who's using these and what application is it meant for, really? So I understand that it's meant to measure down high sensitivity essentially, but what kind of product or application requires such a measurement?
The high resolution one?
Yeah.
The lots. It depends. So one of the ones I've seen many examples from is petroleum analysis. So if you're looking at crude oil, there's a huge number of different hydrocarbons that are present in the sample, that complicated. And separating them can be hard because they all are very hydrophobic, and it's sludge. Like you don't want to inject sludge to an HPLC or something like that. You can get away with these high resolution measurements, or petroleomics is what they call it. But there's other things too. Any type of a large macromolecule, because you go up in mass, it's harder to separate it from other things of large mass. But if you have these high resolution instruments, you can do it. You can still get very accurate measurements of the mass of things. So protein analysis or proteomics is a big one for that too. There's a lot of interest in looking at things like many of the new therapies that are emerging are biologics. So they're basically like antibody-based drugs. So it's a drug, but it's really a protein that's been made in some kind of cell system, and then it's administered as a therapy. But these are large biomolecules, and you really want to make sure you've made them correctly. Even like a sugar that's on the wrong position within the antibody can change its effect biologically. Right. So that's another application for these is that you can get such mass accuracy, you can tell whether or not it's the right sugar that's present on the antibody that you're making that has, you know, a megadalton size, be really big.
Out of curiosity, when you were talking about the structure of how mass spec works, you were mentioning that the first step is ionization, and then after that, the ion will, or the ionized charged particle will go through kind of a series of tunnels through the mass spec inside, and it's directed by. That's what I want to know. What is it directed by? Like how does the magnetic field make it move through the mass spec?
So any type of charged particle will be influenced by another charged particle or electromagnetic field. And so if you,
Magnets.
it can be a magnet. Yeah. So there's no short answer to your question. I know I was doing this with my hand saying it's going through a trajectory. The reality is sometimes it's a straight line, but you have a
Okay.
device that sets up varying electromagnetic fields so that specific mass charge ratios are stable while other ones are not stable.
Mhm.
You can also do a setup where the ions are formed and they're all kind of sort of sitting at the start line, and then you hit them with a pulse of energy so that they all get the exact amount of kinetic energy.
Okay.
Kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared, but because their masses are different, their velocities are different. So it means that the lightest ions go fastest and the heaviest ones go the slowest, and
Right.
the time of flight. There's actually a variety of different flavors of how you
Mhm.
separate ions, and they have different pros and cons, and they have different price tags associated with them. And so in my lab, I have the ability to separate things using quadrupole, which is lower resolution, but it has very high sensitivity. Also have time of flight, my lab as well, which has higher resolution, and this separates things just based on giving them all pulse of energy, and they all start off, but the lightest ones go the fastest, and they win the race to the finish line to the detector. Um, yeah, but there's other technologies that are out there that I don't possess in my lab that can get you even higher resolution. And then every mass spec vendor is trying to make something unique that gives them an edge in the market. And so they're making these hybrid technologies where you have the ability to separate with the quadrupole and then time of flight, or then there's other like, traps and Orbitraps or trapping ions, or some of the latest developments are in something called ion mobility, where it's like electrophoresis, if you're familiar with electrophoresis, but in the gas phase.
Mhm.
So you have a current of gas flowing in one direction, and then the ions are flowing based on the electric field in the other direction. So something with high friction would have trouble making it through that cloud of gas going against it,
Right. Okay.
whereas something that has low friction makes it through. So it's measuring collisional cross section is
Mhm.
essentially what it's doing. And so you're separating within the mass spec based on these orthogonal properties other than mass. Anyways,
Like a way of filtering different charged ions in ways, like you said, other than mass.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of every year in June, being first week of June, there's the American Society for Mass Spectrometry meeting, and it's the big show. Every vendor shows up. They spend big bucks to have like a big hospitality suite where they get free drinks and food and stuff like that. But they have an example of all of their latest technology, and the the unwritten word, I guess, I don't know if this is really true, but I think every vendor tries to release something new at ASMS every year. Just the time where it's like it's the same thing for like the automotive show, the latest car from Honda, pull the tarp off it and stuff like that. So I've actually been part of unveiling ceremonies at ASMS where one company in particular, Agilent, invited some of their customers out, and this was in Indianapolis. They took us to the Indy 500 track, the
Ah, very
Brickyard. It was
nice.
super cool. And they had a new instrument under a tarp. We didn't know what it was, and they handed us champagne, and then they pulled the tarp off, and we all cheers to the new innovation that they released that year and stuff. So my point is, I'm digressing here, but my point is that there's a lot of different technologies to separate ions once you've made ions,
Hmm.
and it's a industrial race to have market edge. Who can do it the best with unique properties? It's great for the field because there's so much interest in mass spectrometry because of how versatile it is and how many ways it can be used. The client base is huge, the market is huge, vendors make quite a bit of money off of this, and so their um, drive to innovate, make new developments is great, supported by the fact there's many academics who also just want to see the field
Grow.
evolve,
Yeah.
and so they're also innovating new technologies at the same time, which get adopted or the patents get bought or something like that from different vendors. And So the whole field really is progressing. If you compare that to other types of technologies, I'll admit I'm less familiar, but something like, UV vis spectrophotometry, for sure, I'm sure there's, different developments that are happening, but that technology has already been stable for the last many decades.
Right.
Whereas every single year you go to ASMS, somebody's got some kind of new toy, and the whole crowd's like, "Whoa, look what they can do now!" And it's really fun.
Are you going this year?
Yep.
Have you been every single year?
No, I've missed a few. My first one was when I was an undergrad, actually.
Really
in
nice.
2000. Yeah, presented a poster, and then I went a number of years in the early 2000s, and then I skipped a few. But I've been going more recently. At ASMS meeting, the Canadian Society for Mass Spectrometry hosts an annual general meeting because many Canadians are at that meeting, so we're all in the same spot. And I am on the executive for the Canadian Society for Mass Spectrometry, so I help host that meeting. So there's political reasons in addition to the science that drive me to go to that meeting.
I was always curious. Could you just explain a bit more about what an Orbitrap is?
Sure.
I'll put an image somewhere above.
Yeah, did I use that word in my earlier answer?
You did, but I also wanted to know the difference between an Orbitrap and an Iontrap. And I don't know if they're the same thing.
Yeah, they're not.
So,
okay. Yeah, this is where having slides and pictures is handy.
I can put slides.
Yeah.
You can discuss it, and I'll have the slides up.
So, an Orbitrap is technology that is exclusively owned by Thermo Scientific right now. And it's a device that injects ions into a trap. So it's trapping ions. So I guess you could call it an ion trap, although it's not the same thing as a traditional ion trap, but it's trapped ions in there. And the ions have there's an electrode in the middle that is parabolic, and then the outside electrodes are also parabolic. And there's a voltage waveform set up so that the ions go in a circular form around the inner electrode and go back and forth in the Orbitrap. They just essentially cycle back and forth as they spin around the inner electrode. So there's this orbiting motion, hence the Orbitrap.
Right.
And it goes back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. The rate at which it goes back and forth is dependent on its mass to charge ratio. And so you can measure a frequency signal that's set up by other electrodes sensing that ion going back and forth, do a Fourier transform on that, and then that converts it into what mass to charge ratio must be present to have that frequency that's going back and forth. And the longer you allow it to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, the higher the resolution of the measurement is. So Orbitraps, especially when they first came out, they sold like hotcakes because they were a simple technology. I say that lightly. They're definitely very complicated, but relative to the amount of infrastructure you had to get to achieve that resolution before with a giant magnet, it was simple because it could sit on a bench top.
Right.
It could fit in a lab. You didn't have to get specialized like infrastructure and buildings and things like that for this particular technology. And even today, they make them smaller and smaller. Like you could fit one on top of this bench that I'm speaking in front of. And anyways, it achieves high resolution. So tens of thousands higher resolving power than anything else that was previously on the market at the time. Other technologies have kind of caught up since. But that's an Orbitrap. An Iontrap is so different ways to actually construct it, but one of the most common ways is to have 4 parallel rods, quadrupole, and at the end of the quadrupole is a plate that acts as a voltage gate that ions go into. They get trapped within the rods, and then when you have the voltage that's a barrier at the end, they get trapped into a physical space within the ion trap.
Okay.
Once they're trapped, you can do different things. You can add a specific waveform that gives a resonance excitation to a certain mass charge ratio to eject it out.
Okay.
So you can isolate an ion, and then you can do a resonance excitation that's not as high on the one that didn't get ejected out to cause it to fragment into pieces. And then you can scan out those pieces and figure out based on how the pieces that result, the fragments that form from the ion, is like having a formed jigsaw puzzle, and you smash it on the floor, and then the pieces allow you to put back together to see what the puzzle actually looked like, to give more insight into what the molecule was. So an ion trap allows you to do multiple MS stages or tandem mass spectrometry stages, but it is at lower resolution than an Orbitrap.
So then the Orbitrap has that kind of dual function where it could I guess, separate or filter out specific ions based off of that motion of going back and forth, and it's also a detector at the same time.
Yeah, so that's right. It I'm not sure if I would say it was filtering it. Like the ions that get put into it
Well, they
have
remain
that
in.
remain in
Yeah, they
there.
remain in.
Yeah,
But
remain in there,
yeah.
and they each have their own
Mhm.
frequency at which they go back and forth through along the central electrode. Um, and then yeah, you essentially detect them
Mhm.
at high resolution from that.
Okay, that's cool. Um, Something I wanted to mention was that you did, or you've been part of the Carleton Science Show, the magic show, the chemistry
Yep,
show, right?
yep, yep.
And you were just mentioning to me earlier that one of the videos that you were doing, the explosion balloons on, went viral on the internet.
Gone viral.
A couple
Yeah.
million, like 5.2 million views, which
Yep.
is
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah.
And it really shows how exciting and fun chemistry can be.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious to know, how did that first start? Like, when was the first magic show? What made you guys start it? And it kind of become more so of a yearly tradition now, where you guys do
Yeah.
it multiple times a year.
Oh yeah, for sure. To get a better answer for that question, you're gonna have to ask Bob Burke.
Okay.
I believe the show started many decades ago, in a different sort of format, but the theme and the tension was the same, with Professor Don Wiles, who actually just passed away a few years ago, but had over 50-year career here in the chemistry
Wow.
department. And he used to do these chemistry magic shows way back in the day. And then Bob Burke's been involved for a long time. Jeff Manthorpe is an organic chemist in our department, and he leads the whole thing now. He spearheads it all. And when I got involved, Jeff had already taken over and asked me to join in and do some of the shows. And for a number of years, I helped out with it, and it was a ton of fun. A lot of work, a lot of work. I feel like as an audience, some in the audience, I don't necessarily think they could possibly appreciate how much work actually goes into preparing for the shows. Like a lot of chemical ordering, making the experiments, making the reagents so that it's ready to go, where you just add it together and then it does the thing that it does. But there's a lot of like, you got to heat steps up and cool it down and hit the right pH and like all this kind of stuff. Like a lot of work in it.
Lots of chemistry.
Lots of chemistry, right?
Yeah.
Precisely. And I really have to tip my hat to Jeff Manthorpe. It's a huge publicity thing. It gains so much publicity for the university, for our department, for science. It does so much for STEM. It gets kids interested from a young age. We've had students join our department and they refer back to the fond memory that they had as a kid coming to the magic show, saying,
That's amazing.
turned me on to STEM.
Yeah.
That made me like chemistry. That gave me a favorable impression of Carleton. And the whole show is really being run by Jeff Manthorpe now, who has been on CTV countless times doing demonstrations. He runs virtual shows, he runs indoor shows, he runs outdoor shows. It's a labor of love. It's really his little baby now. But it's so good for the university and so good for STEM and for science. And it was a ton of fun when I was involved back in the day too.
That's awesome. That's all. It's always fascinating to me watching professors and different researchers communicate science in a very fun way that will get audience engaged. It's one thing to talk about the theory of how all of these work, but it's another thing to actually show it. And I think the video is phenomenal. So I'll link it in the description so that people can
That'd
check
be
it
great.
out.
Yeah, that'd be great. And there's many that are recorded online too. You can see snippets, but you can see full videos. Just Carleton Chemistry Magic Show. I'm sure you'd be able to Google a whole slew of YouTube videos and things like that as well on it.
In some closing ideas, I'd like to ask you, for one, you had mentioned earlier the backpack mass spectrometer. And I was curious, two things. One, in airports, they take that swab and they'll kind of like swab your backpack. Is that a mass spec?
Kind of, but not really.
So what is it?
It's an ion mobility spectrometer.
Okay.
So it does a lot of the same things as a mass spec, but it's not actually measuring mass to charge ratio. It's measuring arrival time, which has to do with size and collisional cross section.
Okay.
But it does share some commonalities. Inside all of those instruments, I don't think many people realize this, there's actually a radioactive source. Radioactivity going on there that's nickel 63 emitter that emits hot electrons. And when they swab your backpack and your zipper, they put the little swab inside. A puff of air sucks the contents and the chemicals that they swabbed into the mass spec, where it passes the energized electrons that are coming from that radioactive source. the electrons ionize those molecules. So that's the same. It makes ions.
Right. Okay.
Once they're ionized, they experience electric field, but it's called a drift tube, where there's gas going in one direction, say going left, and the ions, because of electromagnetic field, are being pulled to the right,
Mm-hmm.
and the ones that get the most collisions go the slowest through the tube. Ones that have the least collisions make it through. So you're separating based on mobility,
Mm-hmm.
and based on a lot of past experiments, the people that are running like CBSA and CATSA, they have algorithms that have been designed to recognize patterns of arrival times of different molecules that are potentially hazardous to airplane. So
Right.
they're looking
Okay.
for narcotics and explosives and things like that. And they are quite sensitive. I think there's room for improvement, if we're being honest, because a mass spectrometer would actually tell you the mass to charge ratio rather than just a mobilogram of looking at arrival times. And you could even include ion mobility in a mass spec if you wanted to. The downside is that mass spec is more expensive. Putting them at many checkposts within an airport would be costly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's essentially one type of mass spec, and there's other variations of it as well. There's certain airports that have full body ion mobility systems where you walk in and it puffs air on your clothes and there's a vacuum above you. The CN Tower used to have that before you could go up the CN Tower. I don't know if it still does.
Are those the machines where you have to like stand?
No,
is that
that's
the same?
different. Yeah, that's different.
Okay.
That's based on just radio frequency hitting you, and if there's anything that bounces back that's not soft tissue, it shows it.
Okay.
So if you have something in your pocket that you're concealing, that
Right.
it shows that.
Right.
Yeah, but no, the one that it kind of looks like that. You stand, you put your hands up, and then it shoots a bunch of air at you. You're like, oh, and your hair gets ruffled. But then there's a vacuum that sucks all the molecules that got dislodged up, and it looks for those hazardous things on your person.
Okay.
It's basically like a swab, except
Right.
big one that does your whole body at the same time.
Okay. And then so those machines in the airport that are, you said, more based on ion mobility. Is it possible to detect exactly what the compounds are, or is it more so of a kind of an estimation or prediction of what might be hazardous compounds that are on someone?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm careful what I say here. It's an estimation to a degree, but it's been so rigorously trained
Okay.
that its false positive rate is low.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at a mobilogram, the x-axis of time of when things arrive, the shape of the peaks is rather large compared to a mass spectrometer where you have a very narrow peak at a specific mass and you know exactly what you're looking at. So the naive expectation is like, well, yeah, it's not nearly as good. Can it be as good at detecting things? The difference has been made up by the fact that there's been so much rigorous training that goes into the algorithms that recognize the shapes of arrival times,
Right. Okay.
that it becomes a very effective detection tool.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think in an ideal world, if money wasn't an issue, you could replace them all with mass spectrometers and you could do fragmentation studies on every molecule that you see, and you could be like super certain, and the analytical chemist to me is like, that's a much better answer. But is it actually necessary? No.
Okay.
Still, these things definitely serve the purpose that they're meant to serve. And those ion mobility instruments they're not cheap. Still quite expensive to implement them across, but they're really robust. They're hard to foul them up. They're not subject to some of the other things like carryover and things that other mass specs sometimes have issues with. And so because of the robustness, the ease of use, the CATSA security guards who are doing the swabbing are not, maybe they're scientists, I don't know, they don't have to be. They're trained in their profession to be security detail, and so they could be classified as non-expert users, and they get great results all the time. That's the hallmark of an instrument that's going to do well for a security purpose, because you really don't want it to break and you want it to be used by anybody, and you want to be able to get the same answers every time, which they do.
So one thing about a mass spec is that it's capable, or it's required for it to have a vacuum inside.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
And is that the same thing for an ion mobility?
No, I mean, that's the other thing that makes it simpler, right? Is that you actually have a gas that's intentionally there flowing in one direction as the ions are trying to go in the other direction. So yeah, there's a lot of internal components that are simpler about ion mobility that obviously drive the cost down. Meaning there's less maintenance. You don't have to worry about malfunction. You don't have to think, is the vacuum at the right level? You just use it. So yeah, but every other mass spec, the ions are moving at a very, very high rate. And so you create a vacuum because the very last thing you want is an unexpected collision with a gas molecule. And so if you evacuate all the gas out, it's essentially flying through like what pressure of outer space, and therefore it actually flies in the trajectory through the mass spec without encountering any collisions. But it requires sophisticated pumps to take all the gas away and make a vacuum and stuff like that.
I mean, I remember you showed us the pump that went that was so it's like this massive pump, like probably this big, and it's got turbine, like metal fins that look like something out of a jet engine.
Yep.
And I remember that one of the blades had bent or something.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you explain the story.
I mean, this is a common story. You could be talking about multiple events that happen like this. Yeah, these turbomolecular pumps, or turbo pumps as we call them, they spin 50 to 70,000 RPM. It's really, really fast. And you mentioned it, right? You described it correctly. You know, a bunch of fan blades, and they're in series in different layers, and they have different pitches that they go down. But the idea is that as it's spinning so intensely fast, it pushes the molecules, as a fan does, in one direction only. It doesn't let them come back. And so as a result, it literally pushes all the molecules to a certain pressure, with very low pressure, out of the mass spectrometer. So now you have a vacuum. But yeah, if typically what happens is, like, spinning that fast, colliding with molecules that fast creates heat. The heat eventually kind of builds up. The bearings eventually always will weaken. And if the bearing breaks in any way or goes off kilter and off axis and those fan blades touch the housing, spinning that fast, I've seen times where the example you mentioned, it was nice because it didn't. Hand grenade is probably not the best term to use, but we call it hand grenading inside. Is like somebody threw a grenade inside the mass spec where it just bent and we heard it. And we're like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Turn it off, turn it off.
Yeah.
And oh, it's busted. We'll have to send it out to get repaired. Whereas other times, the worst is when you come in the morning, and these pumps are usually pretty loud, and you come in the morning and the lab's silent. You're like, everything's off. Why is it off? Maybe the power got turned off. But the worst option is because the turbo blew in the night and it was making noise, but nobody was there to hear it. And then it just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And all of a sudden, all those metal fins touch the edge and turn into metallic dust. And all that dust, which is conductive, is now inside the whole mass spec. It happened during my PhD. And it took a professional person from the instrument vendor like a month of 10-hour days of literally using Q-tips on every possible interior surface to take off metallic dust, because it will affect the electric fields that you're trying to intentionally create. Dust was just everywhere. So try to avoid that at all costs.
Are the internals of a mass spec metallic? Like, are they magnetic?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, maybe you could just use a massive magnet, but then I'd just get attracted to the parts itself.
Yes, you're right. A lot of it is magnetic. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's aluminum parts and stuff like that. But even that, you can disrupt this electric field and have space charge effects. There's a lot of different lenses that are like small grids, like a sieve, but really, really fine metal. And you put a potential on that. But if there's a little chunk of metal, it will distort.
Right. Okay.
For it to distort the electromagnetic field, you have space charging effects, as they call it. And the ions, as they come along, should go straight through, and then they get diverted. And now they don't hit the detector, things like that. But yes, most components are very conductive. In fact, some components, like some of the quadruples in my instruments, are actually coated in gold. They want it to be very conductive.
Yeah, I remember the blades did look horribly disfigured, and I remember you were mentioning that it is like crazy expensive to maintain them, and then even worse to actually get a brand new one.
Yeah, I mentioned the price tag for new ones.
Yeah.
Oh, for new turbo?
Yeah,
new turbo. Yeah. No, again, there's many different vendors of turbos out there, and they come in all different shapes and sizes and pumping speeds, etc. But you can easily drop more on a turbo pump, which I could carry in my hand. It's like this big, than you would on like a brand new Honda Civic.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it's pretty crazy how expensive they can be, and preventative maintenance is key. If you hear anything start to be noisy, you can get them rebuilt for a fraction of that cost. Just get the bearings replaced to make sure things are moving smoothly and aligned and all that stuff. But yeah, everything is expensive, and when you buy a mass spectrometer, the vendors will also try to sell you maintenance plans and service contracts, is what they call it, which is like an extended warranty, but it also comes with preventative maintenance on an annual basis. But those service contracts are expensive.
Are they worth it in most cases?
Well, it depends like everything in analytical chemistry, what you're out like the outcome of your experiments and like what your industry is. If you're a huge pharma and you cannot afford a single day of downtime, then yeah, 100% it's worth it. Some service contracts, some of these numbers are outdated. I don't even know if they're necessarily accurate, but it was not unreasonable to think of a service contract costing $50,000 per year per instrument.
Jeez, per year.
Per year per instrument.
Oh.
And like big pharmas would buy 30 mass specs. So you can do the math. It's like millions and millions of dollars just to have a warranty plan in place.
Yeah.
But if you have a multi-billion-dollar drug, drop in the bucket. So it's worth it. Academics point of view, it's hard. I can't afford that.
Yeah.
And so this is where the learning experience comes into play for my students. You know, if things start breaking or starting to sound like they're breaking, so we shut it down, we investigate, we pull out the tool set ourselves, take things apart. And that was very much my experience as a grad student. I had the first part of my first project as a PhD student was doing a lot of manipulation of the hardware, the actual mass spec itself, drilling holes in the side of the thing to put more pumps in it and changing gas valves and pressures here and all over the place. So I have experience with that, but I recognize the value in that too, because then you gain a better appreciation for when something's operating correctly. You know, it sounds right. You know, it's like when you own a car for 5 years more and something goes wrong, you can tell how it always sounds. But it takes that experience, right? And so I feel like it's a very valuable learning skill to impart to the students in my group. And I'm really fortunate to have an awesome lab manager who's got a lot of skills of preventative maintenance. And
what's their name?
Carl.
Shout out to Carl.
Shout out to Carl Waslin. Yeah, Carl did his master's with me. Then he worked for SciEx, a mass spec vendor, for a year. And then I kind of headhunted him back to come be the manager of our mass spec center when we launched it. So he has a lot of experience fixing these things and the intuition that comes from time, just hearing things. And as a result, he's my service contract.
Practice and experience.
Yeah. When things break, I look to him. And of course, the odd time we have a hefty bill when we have to replace an actual component. But we just live each day one at a time and hope things don't break.
Do you see these instruments getting small to the point where like you can fit one in a fridge to test? Because some people don't want to be eating pesticide-ridden fruits. So do you think that it get to a point where it becomes small enough to put it in the fridge and it's actually not like $30,000 for one fridge or even more?
Yeah, I'd like to say yes. I've had conversations with people in industry saying that there is interest out there from places like Amazon or like the large sellers of consumer products, saying they would love to find a way to make consumer-based mass spectrometer to be on the market. You know, even for a price tag of around $1,000 or something like that. And yeah, everybody muses about this kind of stuff. The miniaturization of this, like this question is on the minds of mass spectrometrists all the time. How small can we make it? How cheap can we make it? Where can we use it for if we did that? And every year it keeps trending to smaller and cheaper for certain applications. And I do think we'll get there at one point. It will be expensive for a while, but I think especially when you start having smaller ones where you forego the ability to analyze many, many, many things and make an integrated software just to target one thing. For example, your pesticide example, if you put a mass spectrometer into the fridge and it tested all the time only for the mass of the pesticide or some kind of indicator of fruit spoilage.
Yeah, that's actually a very good one. Way better than the pesticides. Yeah, What about if the fridge itself does refrigerate, but it's also a mass spectrometer?
That's what I mean. Yeah, integrated into it. Yeah. Or you could see like being put into a home HVAC system, right? Where it's always looking, saying, hey, just so you know,
swap out the
filter because this, or just so you know, the dinner you cooked last night released some of this into the air.
Or if you can detect mold in the apartment.
Yes.
Okay, now we're getting into definitely get, because at first when I asked the question about pesticides, I didn't really know if there were any other applications. But then you brought up the spoilage and then you brought up the HVAC. I'm like, yeah, there's definitely a lot of applications that people would want to build build a house or some system with mass specs in it.
Yeah. And I honestly think the technology is already there.
Mm.
It's about price point, it's about the convenience of it all, and making it so user friendly that it's almost unbreakable. But that's just a matter of engineering and catching up.
Yeah.
I think the tech is there. And so I'd love to see it happen. Air handling systems at major department store or in a mall or in an airport. You'd go through these security checks. What if the HVAC system in an airport was always looking for these prohibited compounds? And the moment somebody walks into the airport or walks through a certain hallway or goes in the bathroom or something like that, there's sensors for this type of stuff. And those are kind of like big brother examples, but you can think of a lot of positive spins on how you could use this type of technology to get chemistry insight into everyday products and applications. So we'll see. Car's another one, right? You put one in a car, you could say, your levels of, assuming it's a gas car, your levels of carbon monoxide or fumes or anything like that are a little bit high right now. You consider opening a window or whatever.
Something, yeah.
All those types of things. Mold even in cars.
Even in grocery stores where during the pandemic, that might have been a good example of, I don't know if it's able to test like viral pathogens. Maybe that's a bit, I don't know. You would probably know better about that.
So yes, it can, but there's often a lot of sample workflow and workup beforehand, right? So it's not just going to test the air for viral pathogens. But I don't know.
Perhaps testing pheromones, because I imagine people that are more sick that they would give off different pheromones than people that are healthy.
That's just it. Yeah. I think the holy grail for most mass spec vendors is to put a mass spectrometer beside every hospital bed.
Yeah.
And so you'll see literature is just filled with biomarker based studies. Study the blood or the urine or spit or tears or all these different fluids or even surface of skins and finger swabs for different molecules that are indicative of different states of health.
Okay.
And people are finding these things, and we've got to just find a way to encapsulate all of that knowledge into a platform that's simple, robust, easy to use for medical practitioners, that sits beside the bed, and all they need to do is say to the patient, put your hand here, or lick your finger and stick it there,
right?
Or we'll take a drop of blood, or be here,
right.
something like that, right?
Yeah.
To be honest, even patient monitor, and this already happens. They already monitor the expired breath of patients using mass spectrometry as an indication of kidney failure is one of them.
What do you mean expired breath?
Like your exhale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, your exhale.
That's impressive too.
They use mass spec on newborn screening. There's lots of different applications for all of it. And I think, the more we can make it user friendly so that anybody can just do it by touching this thing, you're going to see it show up in consumer products and stuff. I mean, that's the dream of everybody in my field.
Yeah.
You'd love to see it be adapted for lots of different options, but time will tell.
So what's the biggest challenge with that?
So one of the challenges,
because you said that the company made a mass spec that can fit in the bag.
Yeah.
How do they pump air out of it?
Yeah, that's one of the things, is having a full vacuum. The smaller you make things, the harder it is. It's just like same with cell phones. Old cell phones are giant things you hold up to your ear, and you make them smaller and smaller with more features, but you have to overcome technical hurdles and everything. One of the things that's really hard from a mass spec perspective is that to control the trajectory of ions, if you make the space smaller, you have to use a higher voltage. But if you have a higher voltage in a smaller space, the chance of arcing is higher, especially if you don't have a good enough vacuum. And the moment there's a significant arc from one electrode to another, it scorches it, and now the electric field's distorted and the whole thing's garbage. Right. So you have to be really careful. I've seen examples from a researcher named Graham Cooks, fathers of mass spectrometry, still alive. I met him at a conference last year. He's made so many amazing contributions to mass spectrometry, but one of the things is he's made Iontraps that are the size of a quarter. They're really small and they do function, but the limitations are significant because of these need for very high voltages and high vacuums, this kind of stuff. But these are the things that are challenges that are supposed to inspire the next future of generations of electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and people that are designing these devices. Ways to come around this. Some of the backpack ones that I mentioned don't need as much vacuum. One of the downsides to having less vacuum is that your sensitivity is hurt because some molecules have collisions and go off course and don't get detected.
Right. Okay.
The other thing is that if you don't have good vacuum, you get oxygen in there. And oxygen is very reactive. And the last thing you want is an ionized molecule that has some kind of kinetic energy reacting with oxygen. It becomes a very reactive situation. So you can actually start making molecules by virtue of doing mass spectrometry that weren't there before you did the experiment. So you got to think of these things. But then again, you can also just correct for that and ignore that ion, knowing that's an artifact.
Is it possible to have a like a mass spec that already comes with a vacuum chamber where the air is already sucked out, but then you have maybe, I don't know, like an airlock on both sides so that you let something in and all you have to do is just remove the air from that chamber and then open it up to the actual vacuum isolated area?
Yeah, maybe. But one of the things that it's hard to appreciate is how many molecules are present even in like a drop of liquid. So on my mass spec, which is a relatively big one, it has 3 pumps. They're working, they pump 700 liters per second. Now, it's not that they're always pumping that amount, but that's how fast that they would pump had there be that much flow through it. There's not much going through it when it's at vacuum because there's just not much in. My point is it's at a very, very low vacuum. But even if I take 1 drop of liquid and I put it to the orifice, you can see the vacuum go up quite a bit. There's so many molecules present. So I like your idea is great. I love that entrepreneurial spirit. But it's hard. Like even something like that, it's hard because every time you introduce a new sample, that's a lot of molecules in that sample. And what is it? Is it a dry sample or is it a liquid sample? And the liquid itself, that solvent, that's a lot of molecules. And so it will change the vacuum. And now you're dealing with a small area. So a small volume fills a small area faster than a big area. These are the logistical challenges, but every year something else cool comes out of the Mass Spec conference, and I look forward to that part of that conference probably the most every year. To see what innovations have happened in the calendar year leading up to it, and what kind of interesting companies. I'll say this too about the Mass Spec conference. The first year I went, there was probably 20 something companies. Last year there was over 400.
Wow, really?
Yep, and that's not just companies that make Mass Spec. Those are companies that have specialized niche uses for mass spec,
like other parts of
improved
processes in the mass spec.
Exactly. Yeah. To to customize your mass spec from an analytical throughput or performance characteristics type.
Man, I thought that it was. I definitely didn't think it was that large of a field to the point where it can grow from 20 companies to 400 companies, because that means there must be a significant progress that these companies can make to stay afloat for all that many years.
Yeah, well, and it's not cheap to be at this conference, so that's a fraction of the companies that really exist out there. These companies all drop a pretty penny to be at this conference and to be represented and have access to the clientele of the world. So yeah, I'm sure for every company that makes it to mass spec or to ASMS, there's guessing, but a dozen that don't come. So there's a lot of industry out there.
Wow. Okay, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Jeff Smith, for your time. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and hopefully in a couple of years we'll have another chat, and then who knows, maybe there's a small mass spec in next to each hospital bed, and it's becoming more integrated. I mean, hopefully with AI, it becomes a lot better at prediction tools, so that you can maybe become a little less accurate in terms of mass measurement, but you can have a lot better algorithms that can predict what the products are. So that will help with the limitations.
Yeah, and most vendors are looking at AI now. But thanks for having me. This was very enjoyable, and I always like talking about this stuff. I'm happy to come back anytime.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, and have a lovely weekend.
All right, you too.
Thanks for listening, everyone.